Okay, so you're all very welcome to today's webinar, today's Let's Talk Pigs series. We're going to look at advances in weaning pig nutrition, and with me today we have Dr. Peadar Lawlor, Principal Research Officer in Teagasc Moorepark here, and also Louise Clark, Specialist Pig Advisor up in Ballyhaise, who's panelist and will be facilitating us with the questions as well towards the end. On that, I can just want to remind you to put in your questions through the Q&A slot at the bottom of the screen there. So if you hover your cursor on the bottom of the screen there, you'll be able to put in your questions, and Louise will filter those and sequence them for the questions and answer session at the end. You can also put them in through the chat option, but it's better if they come through the Q&A. So just a bit of background on Peadar for those of you that don't know him. As I said, he's the Principal Research Officer with us here in the Pig Research Department, Pig Development Department in Moorepark. He's got almost 30 years of experience in pig research and also on the advisory side. His research interests are broad, mainly I suppose on the nutrition side. He's done a lot of work on grower nutrition, sow nutrition, looking at alternative feed ingredients, liquid feeding, and anything that will do associated with improving feed conversion efficiencies. He's also worked on the areas of salmonella, and also on he's done some research on GMO. But I suppose he's most passionate about the nutrition and management of the post-weaned pig or the newly weaned pig. He completed a master's and PhD in that area and has completed several projects since then. And this October coming, he's going to start 2 externally funded projects on the transitioning of the weaned pig. So it's an area that's close to his heart. He has over 100 publications, peer-reviewed publications to his name. That includes review papers and also a chapter in a book, which he'll mention later on today. He's an adjunct lecturer with the Department of Engineering in NUI Galway, and he's also sat on many boards such as the European Food Safety FEDAP board. He's been an editorial member of the Journal of Animal Science board and on the chemical subcommittee for the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. So lots of experience and plenty of information to give us today. So I'll pass over to you there, Peadar, now to talk about advances in weaning pig nutrition.
Thanks, Kieran. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Kieran said, the title of my talk will be Advances in Weaning Nutrition. And I suppose really my aim is that by the end of this talk that you will maybe have a better understanding of the nutritional requirements of pigs in the post-weaning period, and that maybe that you'll have a more in-depth insight into how nutritional programs at that time are put into place and why they're put into place. So to introduce the topic, first of all, weaning is probably the most stressful period in the animal in the pig's life. Now I think it is the most stressful period. The pig is removed abruptly from the sow, and while on the sow, the pig has had small meals 20 times a day. So the pig suckles the sow 20 times a day. It's then removed to strange surroundings and mixed with strange pigs in a different pen and fed a dry diet, predominantly of vegetable origin. So very different to the milk diet that it had got prior to weaning. So it's not surprising that pigs suffer a growth check. And this growth check really it's a dip in growth rate. They have been growing quite fast prior to weaning, and you get a dip in growth rate for a period of time. We've always been challenged to try and minimize this dip in growth or this growth check. But the reality is that in the last 10 years, our born alive per litter has increased by 2.34 pigs. And that means that now we have larger litters, we have lighter piglets born and weaned, and we have more variable pigs at birth and weaning, more variable in terms of weight. But I suppose, if that wasn't enough, we have even greater challenges ahead of us. There's going to be continued selection for increased litter size, even more than is there currently, and because it's still economic to do this, or this is what the breeding companies are saying. There's going to be increased pressure to reduce antibiotic usage. That's going to bring issues. And I suppose the biggest thing that we need to look to is the removal of zinc oxide after June 2022. So there's no one simple off-the-shelf solution to increasing feed intake and increasing growth rate immediately post-weaning. In many cases, what will help a lot is adhering to good management practices. Anything that can increase feed intake in particular. If you're not doing this currently, you should be doing it. But we can also tweak some of our feeding programs. And there's also a place for some of the feed additives, particularly as in a strategy to live without zinc oxide. The payoff, if we can increase intake post-weaning in the immediate post-weaning period, is that we're going to get a reduction in mortality. We will improve lifetime growth, and we will reduce days to slaughter. And at the end of the day, this is more money in your pocket. So feed programs for pigs for weaned pigs is the first item I want to look at. And this can be confusing to lots of people, because there's a lot of conflicting information out there with regard to feeding programs for weaned pigs. There's many different ways to design and implement feeding programs, and a lot of this will depend on what are the goals and the objectives of a nutritionist or a particular farmer. And farms can have very, very different goals. I'm going to take 3 examples here. There's a multitude of examples, but we'll take the first one. A goal on one farm might be to maximize growth and optimize feed efficiency now. That might be a farm that is producing, selling weaners at 30 kilos. They'll want to get growth onto their pigs as quickly as possible. So that type of farmer may have to feed high-powered diets, and maybe quite a lot of them to meet that objective. Another particular farm might have an objective to maximize lifetime growth and optimize feed efficiency. This is a very different objective. And their overall objective would be to reduce feed cost per kilo dead weight. In this instance, that farm might be feeding high-powered diets, but a lot less of them, or for a shorter period of time, and benefiting maybe from some compensatory growth in the weaner period, and ending up with a reduced cost per kilo dead weight. Another scenario might be a farm that has a post-weaning diarrhea problem. And that farm will have to have a very different strategy or program. It may, to get on top of this problem, and a large number of units will have this issue after June 2022, when zinc is removed. To get on top of this problem, one of the items that is most successful would be reducing protein in the diet. And it may be that to get protein down sufficiently low, that you will also have to reduce your lysine level, or your amino acid levels in the diet. So you're feeding very, very different post-weaning diets in this particular scenario. So I suppose what I want to emphasize is that there's no one size to fit all. Each farm is different and unique, and a feed program on one farm is not necessarily going to be the feed program of choice on another farm. And the aim here is really to understand the relationship. This is the aim of the presentation, so that you understand the relationship between diet and growth at the end of it. And maybe to look at some of the nutrient requirements for pigs post-weaning. And I'm going to briefly talk about maybe a select number of feed additives that could be used as alternatives, or in the strategy to work without zinc oxide in the future. So if we talk about the value of feed additives, well, first of all, it's oftentimes stated that 1 kilo at weaning, or at the end of stage 1, weaner stage, that 1 kilo advantage is worth 3 kilos when the pig is sold. This is what's oftentimes said. Well, I suppose the question is really, is that true? In other words, does increased finisher growth always follow on from increased post-weaning growth? And I suppose the answer is yes, if the pig is fundamentally changed. In other words, that there is an improvement in digestive or immune system in the pig. And things that can do that are things like increasing weaning age. We'll talk about this in a minute. and maybe even increasing weaning weight, if that increased weaning weight has resulted because the pigs had an increased birth weight. So the fundamental changes in the pig are related to the immune system and the digestive functions in the pig. They're more developed or more advanced. The answer to the question would be no, if the change resulting from the intervention is transitory. In other words, it only occurs during the period of time while the diet is fed or while the intervention is applied. And things like this that have transitory effect would be something like post-weaning diet complexity. And what we're talking about here is the addition of milk powders, large levels of milk powders, maybe fish meal, plasma if it can be used to the diet. Addition of fat will also give a transitory or a short-term benefit, as will amino acids. You could increase the level of amino acids, but the benefit, you get the benefit there and then, but not thereafter. Antibiotics the same, and the use of milk replacers would be similar. So I suppose what I just wanted to emphasize to you is, if you are making an intervention, including a new additive or an ingredient in your diet, you should only consider the benefit gained during the period of feeding that particular additive or ingredient, without projecting additional benefit. That is, of course, unless the additional benefit has been demonstrated and documented. So don't project that additional benefit unless you are shown proof that that in a trial, in a research, an independent research provider, in a published document, that has been proven. Where the pig has been fundamentally changed, we'll look at weaning age here next. And I suppose if you go back to the early 90s, virtually all units in the country were weaning pigs at 21 days of age. And I suppose pigs were being weaned early at 21 days so that sow productivity could be increased, or that was the aim. Now, in America, they went even further, and they weaned pigs they went down at one stage somewhere between 12 and 15 days of age. But the issue with a young weaning age is that you have more health and mortality problems in your pigs, and you have increased feed costs. We have shown in Moorepark that 1 day increase in weaning age is worth 500 grams at 28 days after weaning. And that 500 grams magnifies so that by the time of slaughter, it could be a 2.5 or 3 kilo advantage. So I suppose the reason for this is that younger pigs have a much less well-developed digestive tract. And because of this, more undigested feed appears in the gut or is retained in the gut of the younger pigs. And because of this, you get a proliferation or growth of pathogenic or deleterious microorganisms like E. coli that will cause scour, or that can potentially cause scour. And in a trial in Moorepark, we found that E. coli counts in the gut were higher in 3-week-old compared to 4-week-old pigs. And if we look at this particular trial and look at the growth of the animals in that trial, you can see that as you go from, and we're looking at average daily gain here, as you go from 3-week weaning to 4-week weaning to 5-week weaning, each time you get an increase in growth rate up to 10 weeks of age. And you can see that there's even an improvement in feed efficiency here at 5-week weaning. But I suppose also you need to look at mortality. You can see here that pigs weaned at 3 weeks have a much higher level of mortality. Now, the mortality in the 4- and 5-week weaned pigs is quite low, but look at the mortality in the pigs weaned at 3 weeks, 14 versus 1 and 4%. Weaning weight then, I suppose high intake in the first week after weaning is very positively related to high lifetime growth performance in pigs. And the key to achieving high feed intakes is to wean heavier pigs. But I suppose the question is, does it matter how the pigs became heavier in the first place? And the answer to that question is it certainly does. We take an example here, and we have an advantage of half a kilo at weaning for each pig. So pigs, these pigs here are fed milk replacer and a lot of creep feed during the lactation period or while they're suckling the sow, and you get a half kilo advantage in weaning weight. But if you look, and this is significant at that time, but if you look at 27 days post-weaning, there's no difference between the treatments. And certainly if you look at day 129 at slaughter, 129 post-weaning, which was slaughter weight, there was no difference in slaughter weight. So the advantage was lost by the time of slaughter. On the other hand, look at this particular graph, and this is a 1.2 advantage, a kilo advantage in weaning weight in this particular one. And this 1.2 kilo advantage in weaning weight came about because your pigs were marginally heavier, 1.55 kilos at birth compared to 1.38 kilos at birth. But you can see that that small advantage gave you the 1.2 kilos at weaning and gave you a much higher, a magnified advantage again at day 26 post-weaning. And if we looked out further at slaughter, you would have an even greater weight advantage. So a fundamental change has occurred in those animals, and they have greater lifetime performance. Pre-weaning management, I suppose what we're trying to say, to a large extent cannot correct for low birth weight in your pigs. The importance of birth weight is because the pigs that are born heavier will have a higher muscle fiber number. And because of this, they have a greater lean growth potential, which will mean that their growth rate will be higher and they will have an improved feed efficiency. So it's important that we get our pigs born heavy in the first place. I want to talk briefly then about the diet of the pig, and I'm just going to talk about two ingredients really, milk products and the cereals in the diet. I suppose I would be inclined to say that milk products are essential, and I think it's well known that they're essential to be included in starter and linked diets. They're expensive but very important constituents of the post-weaning diets. It has been well shown that, you know, including milk products will give you a reduction in slaughter age of 5 days. They will also help to reduce mortality, the incidence of scour and veterinary interventions in your pigs in the post-weaning period. And in my mind, the most important component of the milk powders is lactose. Lactose is simply the milk sugar, and it's found in the whey fraction of the diet, or the whey fraction of the milk. And I suppose it's important because the pig post-weaning doesn't have a huge ability to acidify its stomach. And it's important to get acidification or a low pH in the pig's stomach post-weaning. That's going to be the first barrier to pathogens like E. coli entering into the gut. But lactose can be fermented by bacteria in the stomach, fermented down to lactic acid, and that can create an acidic environment in the pig's stomach and help to eliminate or to prevent E. coli entering the digestive tract. There's also a benefit from including casein, and casein is in the dried skim portion of the milk. So substituting casein for soy protein in the first few weeks after weaning is beneficial, but if you keep substituting casein for soya after 2 weeks, the benefit is quite small. So we should be getting on to a more vegetable-based diet at that point. If you're increasing your levels of milk powders or feeding them for longer, the effect is going to be transitory, so short-lived. You'll get a benefit while feeding and a weight advantage, but this advantage is frequently lost by transfer to the finisher stage. If we look at post-weaning diet again, and here I'm just going to talk about cooking cereals. We would have done a lot of work on this in Moorepark as well down the years. we looked at cooking of maize and wheat for inclusion in starter and linked diets. And I think most of the starter and linked diets that are used out there include cooked cereal diets in their formulation. And the idea is that you gelatinize the starch or make the starch more available for enzymatic action in the pig or digestion in the pig. The reality is our experiments with steam flaking of maize and wheat did not show any benefit to the process. Now, in the case of barley, it may be quite different. We didn't heat treat barley, but if barley is heat treated, because it has a higher fiber content, you may get, and lots of other people have found benefits to heat treating barley for use in wean pig diets. I suppose what I would be inclined to say to people would be, you know, I wouldn't go to the expense of including a cooked cereal in my starter and linked diets. I would rather ensure that my cereal quality that I'm using is good, that it's well screened, and that it has a low microbial load. And I think you'll be fine with including cereals like that in those particular diets, and it will reduce your cost. The next item people always talk about is quantity of starter and link to feed. And this is getting into your diet program, I suppose. And I suppose the first thing is that we must feed high density milk-rich diets for fast and efficient lifetime growth. So they should be fed, they have to be fed. But the reality is that these diets, these starter and link diets, they're very expensive, and because of this, their overuse must be avoided. I suppose remember why they're there in the first place. They're there to stimulate energy intake and nutrient intake immediately after weaning. And because of this stimulated intake and growth at that time, to stimulate or to promote increased lifetime growth. This is a trial we did in Moorepark. It was reported in 2013, where we looked at different levels of starter and link fed to pigs post-weaning. So the starter diet was fed at 1 kilo per pig up to 4 kilos per pig, or the link diet at 3 kilos per pig up to 12 kilos per pig. But what's interesting is if you look down here at the growth rate of these animals, you look across the page here, and there's no significant difference. Okay, you might see marginal differences here, but statistically, there's no difference in growth rate between these allocations of starter and link. Look at the feed conversion ratio. They're virtually identical across the page. So I suppose if you were to look at that alone, you would say, well, I'll get away with feeding 1 kilo of starter and 3 kilos of link. I would warn against that. Look at the mortality level of pigs at that level of feeding. You have a 10% mortality. So it's likely that higher levels are required to reduce that level of mortality, but we certainly don't need to be going up to levels of 3 and 9 or 4 and 12. So it's important also to look at the health and mortality. Don't just look at growth rate of your pigs and feed efficiency. Look at how the diets affect health and mortality. Starter and link diets as low as 1 and 3 kilos, respectively, could be very sufficient for heavy, healthy pigs at weaning. Light pigs weaned will likely benefit from a higher allocation of starter and link. And on units maybe where there are health problems, the pigs will also benefit from a higher level of starter and link. Now I want to get into talking a little bit about nutritional requirements for your pigs. I'm going to talk about energy, how much energy is required by the pig, and how much amino acids. And with regard to the energy, first of all, it's important maybe to let you know which type of energy we're talking about. And energy is supplied to the pig in the form of the feed or the diet that they're given. And the energy in the diet minus the energy in the feces, minus the energy in the urine and gas is the metabolizable energy. And this is what we're going to be talking about here as we go through this. Now, if you want to convert this back to digestible energy, you just multiply the values that I give you by 1.04. So Metabolizable energy is about 96% of digestible energy. The weaned pig's growth is very limited by the pig's feed intake capacity. And it's important to remember that the ability of the pigs to take in feed is quite low at the time of weaning. So this is an energy-dependent phase of growth. And you can calculate theoretically how much intake a pig should have. And this is one of the formulas that might be used to do this. I'm not going to even get into it, but it's all predicated on the body weight of the pig, or the average body weight of the pig at that time. But the reality is that physical intake is low in pigs post-weaning. So in reality, the theoretical intake is never achieved. But we strive to achieve this theoretical intake, and we do this by increasing the energy density in our starter and linked diets. And we try to maximize physical feed intake. And this is all a balancing act, because in practice, the energy intake of your pigs is their feed intake multiplied by the energy density in the diet. We're going to look at this in a little bit more detail here. And I'm going to take an example of a farm that is feeding a starter diet for 1 week, a linked diet for 2 weeks, and then they're straight on to a weaner diet. So your linked diet has 16 megajoules of metabolizable energy. Sorry, your starter diet has 16 of metabolizable energy and 15 megajoules of metabolizable energy in your linked diet. The average daily feed intake of the pigs at each one of the weeks post-weaning is 220 in week 1, 250 grams per day in week 2, and 700 grams per day in week 3, and so on. So these are actual intakes that are measured on the unit. So using these two pieces of information, we can calculate the energy intake of our pigs. So we take the first week, our pigs are consuming 3.5 megajoules of metabolizable energy per day. We can go on a step further here, and we can look at, well, using the growth rate of the animals, how much should these pigs be taking in? What is their theoretical feed intake or energy intake? And implying the equation I showed you on the previous page, the predicted energy intake should be 6.4. You can see it's a lot higher than what we have achieved on the unit. 8.1 in the second week, still higher than that achieved in the second week, so that we're achieving just slightly over 55% of predicted energy intake in week 1 post-weaning. And we're still not achieving predicted energy intake in week 2, and it's only week 3 before we're up at predicted energy intake levels. So maybe to explain this another way, take an 8-kilo pig, a pig that's weaned at 8 kilo, and you want that pig to achieve its predicted energy intake in the first week post-weaning. And if that pig was taken in, as in the example, 220 grams of feed per day on average in that first week, you would need to be feeding a diet as high as 23 megajoules of metabolizable energy per kilo. The reality is that's simply not possible or economical. Another alternative is, okay, well, I'll feed my 16 megajoule diet, which is my standard starter diet, but I'll push my feed intake. Well, you'd have to push feed intake up to 360 grams per day on that particular diet. And that's not achievable. Feed intakes of 200 to 250 grams per day are generally considered to be good in the initial post-weaning period. So it's not surprising that we have this growth lag after weaning. In other words, the pig has a dip in growth. It's not until the 3rd week following weaning that the energy intake of the pig actually matches that predicted by NRC, or the theoretical energy requirement. And this is another way of looking at it. This graph just depicts that. This is the energy density of the diet. And we take a 16 megajoule diet. If you wanted to wean a pig of 8 kilos, that pig would have to be taking in 360 grams of feed to meet its predicted energy intake requirement. You can see here that if we lower the energy density in the diet, you'd have to take in even more. If we increase the energy density in the diet, you can get away with a physical intake of slightly less, but you're still nowhere near that you are achieving on the unit, which is 220 grams per day. So energy intake increases as weaning weight of the pig increases. Increasing energy density in the diet will help to achieve increased energy intake, but there is a practical and economical limit to doing this to the diet. So in practice, what is necessary is that we stimulate feed intake following weaning to maximize energy intake, because these diet alterations may not be either practical or economical. And I suppose what we need to start getting into, or a habit of doing now, is to keep good records on intake and the growth of our pigs post-weaning, so that we can actually custom design energy densities for our pigs, and then use those energy densities or energy intakes to calculate an energy, a nutrient to energy ratio, so that we can optimize feed efficiency and growth rate at our pigs. So the first nutrient that we would be talking about, including in our diet as a proportion of the energy in the diet, are the amino acids. And amino acids, simply put, are the building blocks for protein. And remember, protein is the major constituent of lean or gain in your pigs. And this is what you want the pigs to be putting on. It's very easy to calculate how much standardized ileal digestible lysine is required by weaned pigs. For every kilo of body weight gain that the pig makes, they're going to require 19 grams of SID lysine. So it's a very simple figure to remember: 19 grams per kilo of body weight gain. 19 grams of SID lysine per kilo of body weight gain. So to determine the correct lysine density in a post-weaning diet, you need to know the post-weaning growth rate of your pigs. And you need to know the post-weaning daily feed intake. You're using that to calculate the energy intake of your pigs. Otherwise, you could end up with very imprecise lysine to energy ratios. This could be costly because it could result in reduced growth in your pigs and a deterioration in feed efficiency in the pigs. And because this period after weaning is very energy dependent in terms of a stage of growth, it is critical that the lysine to energy ratio is optimized. So let's try and do that here, and we're using the same example that we had in previous slides. We're still feeding our same starter diet for 1 week, our link diet for 2 weeks. We still have the same intakes in weeks 1 to 4 post-weaning, and we still end up with the same energy intakes as we had before. This time, however, we're going to try and calculate from the growth rate of the pig, what is the SID lysine requirement of the pig on a daily basis. And you can see here again, it's 19 grams of SID lysine per kilo body weight gain. So in fact, we end up in week 1, our pigs need 3.8 grams of SID lysine per day. 7.13 in week 2 and 10.64 in week 3. And from these two figures here, we can calculate the SID lysine to metabolizable energy ratio. And you can see in this instance, for our starter diet, it's 1.08. For our link diet in week 2, it's 1.06. And in week 3, it's 1.01. So that you can calculate the correct SID lysine density in grams per kilo in your starter diet. And that, in this particular example, works out at 17.3 grams of SID lysine per kilo, or 1.73% lysine. Your link diet should be somewhere between 15.8 and 15.2, so maybe somewhere around 15.5 might be a good average for your link diet. So in terms of practical diet formulation, the first thing you would do is determine the energy intake of your pigs. And this is simply calculated by multiplying the feed intake of the pigs by the energy density in the diet. You'll then come along and you calculate, well, what is my lysine requirement, my SID lysine requirement? And that's simply 19 grams per kilo gain. At that stage, then you determine the ratio of lysine to energy. And you use that ratio to determine how much SID lysine should be included in your diet. We move on then to another stage where we include all of the other amino acids as a percentage of lysine in the diet. And this is simply called the ideal protein concept. And this is where you set lysine in the diet at 100%. And you include all of the other amino acids into the diet as a proportion of lysine. Now, to do this, there are very different sources of recommendations. And there will be differences in the recommendations due to differences in methodologies used in the experiments and the calculations and the analysis, etc. Also maybe to do with the breed and the health of the pigs in the experiments reported on. We'll look here at an example of these recommendations. And you can see that, okay, they're quite similar up along here. There is a difference here in threonine. But you come down here, I suppose the most obvious difference here is tryptophan. This is a French recommendation. It shows that tryptophan should be included in the diet at 22% of the lysine level in the diet. An American recommendation from NRC would say that it should be included at 16% of lysine in the diet. Now, I would feel a lot safer with the 22% figure here, in that tryptophan can help to improve intake post-weaning. But it just demonstrates the importance of having a good nutritionist that is able to choose and pick the correct values for your particular diets. I have a red line here under valine, because to my knowledge, these are above this line are the only amino acids that are available, I suppose, commercially in artificial form, and that can be included in diets. All of the other amino acids down under the line must be supplied in the form of protein. So they must come from the ingredient fraction of the diet, your cereals and your soybean in particular, and your milk powders. I want to move on then to talk about reduced crude protein diets. And reducing crude protein in post-weaning diets prevents an excess of undigested protein reaching the large intestine. And what that does then is it reduces the growth of pathogens like E. coli, and it reduces the production of harmful compounds like biogenic amines, which negatively affect gut permeability in the pig. And all of these things here are going to help to reduce the incidence of diarrhea post-weaning. But the reality is the requirements of the weaned pig for amino acids are high. We've just shown it, they're high for growth, but they're also high to counteract health challenges in your pigs. Therefore, low crude protein diets must always be fortified with synthetic amino acids. An example of where crude protein in the diet was reduced from 20 to 17% roughly found that diarrhea was reduced without affecting the growth rate or the protein deposition in pigs. So it's hard enough to get down to 17%, and in some cases you may actually have to pull back your lysine level or your amino acid levels in the diet to get down to 17% crude protein in the diet. We'll move on then to something that follows on from this, which is compensatory growth or gain. And this is simply explained as you have a period of restriction in an animal where their growth rate drops. But in the period afterwards, if they're fed a sufficiently good diet, they can compensate for that drop in gain and gain that weight back. So extremely high SID lysine is needed to meet the estimated requirements in weaned pigs, especially because they have very low feed intake post-weaning. But the issue is that these high lysine, high energy diets are very expensive, and we showed that some of them, you know, the ones that would get us up to theoretical levels of intake are actually impractical. They're not practical. And I suppose an interesting study came out of America in 2018, where they showed that you could reduce the SID level in starter and link diets down to around 1.4 in your starter and 1.35 in your link diet. And so long as you feed a sufficiently high level of lysine in your weaner diet, somewhere in the order of 1.3%, those pigs will, during the first stage, they will not grow as fast as they would have done, but they will compensate during the weaner phase. And this is what this particular trial showed. The advantage of relying on this compensatory growth and reducing our amino acid levels is that not so much of the specialty protein-rich feed ingredients are required in the diets. The things like milk powder, fish meal, plasma if it's being fed, and the feed cost is therefore reduced. But also related to the earlier slide on pulling back protein level, it's easier to pull back protein level when the SID lysine level in the diet is reduced. So there may be a place for this. The next item I'm going to briefly touch on is vitamins and minerals. And with regard to vitamins, these are essential. They're required as cofactors in metabolic reactions in the body, and their inclusion should be precise. And I'm just going to show you examples of recommendations or sources of recommendations. Look across at these recommendations here now. Look at the variation in recommendations by source for different vitamins. Look at vitamin A even, for instance, the variation that occurs between sources. It just emphasizes the importance that you have a good nutritionist available to you that can determine or pick out the recommendation from these lists that is most suitable for your particular unit. We'll move to minerals then, and again, their inclusion needs to be precise. They're essential to include in the diet. We talk about macro minerals that are included in relatively high levels, and we talk about micro minerals. Of the macro minerals, calcium and phosphorus are the most important for the development of skeleton, lean tissue, and muscle contraction and all of that. 99% of the calcium in the body and 80% of the phosphorus in the body are found in the skeleton. So they're critically important for growth. And it's important to get their ratio one to the other correct. Also important would be things like sodium and chloride, which are the components of salt, iron, iodine, manganese, zinc, and copper. But again, I'm just going to whisk through this here, but you'll have it under recording if you need to go back. But these are the recommendations based on source. And again, you can see that there are variations here. And you need to have a good nutritionist. These are the micro minerals. And again, you can see some variation here between the sources. So I'll move from there onto a nutrient that is much more abundant, but that is often forgotten. Water is a nutrient, and it's critically important. It takes more than a week after weaning before a pig restores its daily fluid intake. If you take a suckling pig takes in about 680 mils of fluids per day. But in the first day after weaning, a weaned pig is only taking in about 290 mils of water. And on average, in the first week after weaning, they're only taking in about 442 mils of water. And I suppose what I would be inclined to say is here, look, if your pigs aren't drinking, they're not going to be eating. It's only in the second week after weaning before they're actually taking in more fluid than they would have been prior to weaning. So if you have drinkers that have a restricted flow rate, that's going to reduce your feed intake. And in one trial, average daily gain was reduced by about 15% because water was restricted. I think it's imperative that we should all be providing supplementary drinkers. We used to do this back in the 90s and the noughties. Supply supplementary drinkers for the first 3 days maybe after weaning, 3-4 days after weaning. Cube drinkers, turkey drinkers, whatever, just to give a more ready source of water to your pigs. Obviously, drinker position is crucial, but I reckon that people should now all be using bowl drinkers. It's easier for pigs to find water in bowls than with nipples. And on top of that, you're going to have 30% less water wastage with bowl drinkers as opposed to nipples. I think it's also important that you use the same type of drinker in the weaner house as you have used in the farrowing house. It just means that the pig will be familiar and know what the drinker is for. But this is a very, very important part of feed intake, is your water intake. I'm going to talk briefly now about just some of the feed additives that could be used in a strategy to live without zinc oxide. And the first one would be the organic acids as such. Organic acids like formic, fumaric, citric acid, there's various different acids there and blends of acids. And I suppose the issue is that, and we talked about this already, the pig has insufficient ability. It doesn't have the ability to secrete sufficient quantities of gastric acid or hydrochloric acid to acidify its stomach in the post-weaning period. And that means that it's not able to create a barrier to the likes of E. coli coming into the digestive tract. But this pH or this acidic environment in the stomach is also important because if it's not there, protein digestion is reduced and you get this growth of these diarrhea causing microorganisms like E. coli. At Moorepark, a number of years back, we fed fumaric acid in a trial and we were able to achieve an increase in feed intake of about 32% in the first week after weaning. That's huge. That's a huge intake in the first week. And over the first 3 weeks after weaning, we achieved an increase in feed intake of 11%. I suppose the thing is, if we look at other trials we've done, the response isn't always consistent. You get it in some trials, you don't get it in others. And I suppose what our thinking would be is maybe the health of the animals at a particular time, or the microbial challenge that the pigs are experiencing. The response will be predicated on what that is at a particular time. But I think there is a place for organic acids post-weaning. Another alternative to including organic acids in the diet is feeding a diet with a low acid binding capacity. This is a diet that doesn't bind up as acid in the stomach. And this type of diet can be formulated by using ingredients in the diet that are low in acid binding capacity, or by maybe taking, removing ingredients that have a high acid binding capacity from the diet for a short period of time, or reducing their inclusion in the diet for a short period of time. Things like calcium could be reduced for a short period of time, and that will help to reduce the acid binding capacity of your diet. And it will have a similar effect as including organic acids in your diet. Another group would be probiotics, and another group yet would be prebiotics. Now, oftentimes these two groups are confused, but probiotics are simply live microorganisms which when fed in adequate amounts, they confer a health benefit to the host or to the pig. They can work as alternatives to antibiotics or zinc oxide because some of them have been shown to control pathogens in the gut and to increase growth rate in pigs post-weaning. Some of them can improve the immune system, and some of them function by competitive exclusion, which is actually they grow so fast that they crowd out some of the pathogens like E. coli in the gut. And some of them actually produce antimicrobial compounds that work against some of the pathogens in the gut. In Moorepark, we're now actually feeding probiotics to sows. And the idea is that the sows then excrete, so they're fed maybe for about 10 days before the sow farrows and while the pigs are suckling her, but the sow excretes the probiotic in her dung. The pig takes up the probiotic from the sow's dung and it seeds its own microbiome, and it gets the benefit of the probiotic in that way. And this seems to be working quite well, and it's a very novel way of including probiotic in pig diets. Prebiotics, I said, are different, and maybe the way to remember this is that probiotics are the live microorganisms, and the prebiotics are what the probiotics feed on. These are a substrate that passes through the upper gut, and they provide a substrate for beneficial bacteria lower down the gut. So they might be fed with a probiotic, or you might rely on them on their own to promote the growth of beneficial bacteria in the gut and to crowd out deleterious or pathogenic bacteria. Another group would be exogenous enzymes, and you all may remember Alberto Torres that was here up until about a year ago. And Alberto, as part of his thesis, conducted a meta-analysis that looked at the use of enzymes in diets for weaned pigs. And he looked at all of the literature that was available to him at that particular time. But why would we use enzymes during the post-weaning period anyway? Well, it takes time for enzymatic activity in the pig to develop. So there's plenty of graphs that can show you that you don't have enzyme activity in the pig's gut, and it develops slowly over time. And these exogenous enzymes or feed enzymes can be used to bridge the gap until the piglet has the ability to produce their own enzymes in their digestive tract. It also expands the range of feed ingredients that may be used during this particular time, because it makes maybe some forms of ingredients more available to the pig than they would have been heretofore. I suppose carbohydrases are the most commonly used feed enzymes. And of the carbohydrases, they work on the carbohydrate fraction of the diet. Xylanase and beta-glucanase would be the most common. And what they do is simply they increase the digestibility of substrates present in the non-starch polysaccharide fraction of the diet. I suppose, simply put, in the fiber fraction of the diet, they make it more available for use by the pig. I suppose the thing with enzymes is, and the things with a lot of these additives is, the efficacy of them is inconsistent. You see a benefit sometimes, and you don't always see a benefit. And this is what Alberto was looking at in his meta-analysis. And I just want to set up this slide here, because over here are the sources. These are the trials that were done that in different countries around the world using these different enzymes. These are carbohydrase enzymes. The blue line is important, and look at the red dots here on the left-hand side of the blue line. This is where we have a negative impact on feed efficiency due to feeding enzymes. The black dots tell us there was no response to feeding the enzyme, and the green dots here show where we got positive responses to feeding enzymes in these particular trials. So you can see here that the response to the enzymes is quite inconsistent, but I suppose on the balance of things, you have more positives than negatives for the carbohydrase enzymes, but the response is inconsistent. The next one would be protease. You can see that there is much fewer trials done on protease in weaned pigs to date. And you can see that the response is inconsistent. We have some positive responses, and in some instances, we have no response to protease. I think protease is actually an enzyme that we need to watch for. This has potential to have benefit in the post-weaning period. We just need a little bit more trial work to show that. Where did we get the most response to enzyme use in the post-weaning diet? Well, we get it when we use a complex of enzymes. This is a cocktail of enzymes, various different types of enzymes included together in the diet. And if you look at this here on the left-hand side of the blue line, we have very little red dots. On the right-hand side, we have quite a lot of green. And this indicates to us that in the vast majority of cases, we're getting positive effect on feed efficiency as a result of feeding complexes of feed enzymes. So they have a place in post-weaning diets. I want to summarize what we've talked about up until now, and I'm sorry for maybe going through this a little bit fast, but to overcome the post-weaning growth check, it's important that we target increases in feed and water intake. We should always target birth weight in pigs so that we have heavier pigs at weaning. We need to feed a good quality starter and link diet, and these diets need to contain a good level of milk powders, and in particular, they should contain a high proportion of lactose. But I suppose the levels of the starter and link that we feed should be geared towards pig weaning weight and the health and the optimization of lifetime growth in the pigs. And we can vary this depending on these categories. We need to be able to formulate our diets based on the intake and the growth of pigs typical to those on your unit. Reducing the lysine level in starter and link diets to reduce protein content in the diet, if you have maybe a diarrhea post-weaning diarrhea problem, can be beneficial, and it will allow you to avail of compensatory growth later down the line, so long as you have a weaner diet with a good level of lysine in it. With regard to the additives, some of these will have potential, and you only consider the value of an additive or an ingredient. You only consider the benefit gained during the period which the additive or the ingredient were fed, unless you have evidence otherwise to suggest that the benefit is magnified later on. I suppose the most important thing that I would always say to people is intake, physical feed intake in the first few days after weaning is key. And anything that we can do to stimulate or promote increased feed intake at this time is going to benefit lifetime growth in your pigs. So lastly, I'd just like to mention that the content of this presentation comes from a chapter we have in a book edited by Chantel Farmer. So if any of you are interested in this particular topic or want to delve into it any deeper, this book will be available from about October of this year. So with that, thanks for your attention, and look, if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them for you.
Okay, thanks, Peadar. Thanks very much. That was an excellent, sorry there now. Excellent presentation. Plenty of information in that. So just remind the attendees there now that you can put in questions through the question and answer option at the bottom of your screen there. So if you have any questions, I know Louise has been fielding some there over the past while, so she can start with a few of those. But for the rest of you there attending, if you'd like to put in questions, put them in there now through the question and answer session, and we'll deal them as we go. Okay, Louise, so over to you.
Thanks a million. Thanks, Peadar. That was really good. Peadar, I suppose one of the questions was, we've seen in your presentation that there's various different levels of both starter and link diet that are being fed to pigs. So I think one of them was starter at 1 kilo and link at 3 kilos versus link or starter and link at 3 and 9. But what would you recommend as a feeding levels for both starter and link diets?
Well, I suppose, look, just getting back to the presentation, it's going to vary very much on what's happening on a particular unit. I would say, I suppose if I was going out to a farm, I would say, look at the target that we have in Teagasc, we've had it for a good number of years, is 2 kilos of starter and 5 kilos of link on average, right? But I would be inclined to go a little bit further than that. And I would go to my heavier pigs at weaning, and I would feed less of my starter and less of my link to those animals. And I'd give a higher proportion of it to my lighter pigs at weaning. Also, maybe if you had a unit that maybe the health is not particularly good on the unit, I might be going in stronger with my starter and link, right? But on average, I would like to be somewhere around the 2 kilos of starter and 5 kilos of link.
Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Just another question we had in there, Peadar, have you an idea of what would be the optimum calcium and phosphorus ratio in starter diets?
Well, I suppose the ratio that I use, or that, different people will use different ratios, but I would never go above 2.8. 2.8 is the cutoff. That's calcium to digestible phosphorus ratio.
Perfect. And I suppose we talked.
But you can be well below that, Louise. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. You talked about the importance of birth weight as well. We've seen how important that is. But is there any way to improve the lifetime growth in kind of light-born pigs, say?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question, and it's something that lots of people have been looking at and maybe trying to develop ways of doing that. I think we will find strategies to do that in the next while. I think we're at the infancy of it. The reason I say that is because, remember I talked about muscle fibers and your heavier pig at birth having more muscle fibers. Well, now we know, and it's only in recent years that we know, that some of these muscle fibers you can still get an increase in the number of muscle fibers for a short number of days after the pig's birth, maybe right up to maybe 15 days after the pig's birth. So nutrition at that particular time, while the pigs are suckling the sow, may be critical. If we can get in some things, maybe even the likes of carnitine, which we have looked at in sows in Moorepark in the past, and that may help to increase muscle fiber number at that point. Also, maybe even increasing intake of our pigs, maybe by putting in artificial feed, giving artificial milk replacer or something like that in that period may help us to increase muscle fiber number and give the pig more potential to grow post-weaning.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I suppose you talked about additives as well then, Peadar. Would it be worth introducing an additive that only has the transitory effect, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think most of the additives will only have a transitory effect. That is the reality. That's my reality. Unless somebody can prove to me and show me data that shows that the benefit is magnified later on, it's only then that I will believe what they're telling me, right? Just because it's transitory doesn't mean it's not worth doing, right? And all I was just saying to you is some people try to oversell additives and the benefit of additives. But if you have an additive that gives you a benefit, maybe that reduces your mortality, particularly post-weaning, maybe reduces the incidence of diarrhea, maybe gives you an increase in growth rate, and maybe if that increase in growth rate or that increase in weight persists, it mightn't magnify, but it might persist up to slaughter. Maybe you might have a 1 kilo advantage at 28 days post-weaning. And if that persists all the way to slaughter, well, you have an extra kilo of pig weight to sell at slaughter. You might have more pigs to sell because you have reduced mortality. You might have reduced morbidity because your pigs haven't encountered diarrhea post-weaning, etc. So an additive, just because it's a transitory benefit, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be included.
Perfect, thank you. And then I suppose maybe on compensatory growth, would you recommend reducing the amino acid level in starter and linked diets to avail of that compensatory growth? Okay,
there is a number of there's a number of reports on this compensatory growth, and I think there's some work out of Canada, there's some work out of the US, there might even be some European work at this stage looking at this. But I would be a little bit conservative in the way I would look at this. I think if I was a person or on a farm where maybe post-weaning diarrhea is an issue, I would certainly be looking at this as a tactic. I probably wouldn't go down as low as the 1.4% SID lysine and the 1.35% SID lysine in your linked diet. I might be a little bit higher than that, but I would pull back my lysine levels and to allow me to pull back my protein, to allow me to deal with the post-weaning diarrhea problem. And then I would rely on the compensation during the weaner stage to give me the same growth right up to slaughter. I think it's a tool that we can use, right? And I suppose on another unit, I might say to somebody, no, I'd prefer you go in with a very high nutrient density diet, particularly after weaning, so that you can maximize your energy intake during that period and your nutrient intake during that period. So it'll vary from unit to unit, but I think it's a tool in the box that we can use and potentially use it to reduce feed cost for keto dead weight.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, unit specific, maybe there's a role for
Yeah.
it there. Yeah. I suppose, Peadar, just another one coming in there, in terms of physical feed intake, we all know that's quite hard for pigs post-weaning or after we've weaned them. Is there any research work planned in Moorepark looking at any ways that we can increase feed intake or daily gain in pigs post-weaning?
Yeah, I think Kieran mentioned out at the outside there that we have two projects coming up. They're going to be starting well, one of them will start in October of this year, and another one will start in January of next year. The first one is funded by the Department of Agriculture under its stimulus fund, and it will look exactly at this transitory period, the period while the pig is maybe still suckling the sow and while it transitions into the first stage, and how we can smoothen that period and maybe smoothen that growth trajectory and eliminate or reduce the weight check that we find post-weaning. We have another project then, as I say, it's funded by the European Union. It'll start in January of next year. It will also look at this, but it'll look a little bit at sow feeding, and it'll look at piglet feeding as well, but with the same aim, to try and improve performance of your pigs in the first 3 to 4 days post-weaning in particular. I think it's critical that we get on top of this, because otherwise we're not going to get the potential growth in our pigs right up to slaughter.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. We look forward to hearing with that. And then, Peadar, maybe I suppose, have you any comments on what effect would there be on the sow if piglets were weaned at day 34, 35 versus day 28? Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Okay, Louise, so you're talking about, or the questioner is talking about where we showed the 3 versus 4 versus 5 week weaning.
Yeah.
And I suppose it was just interesting. I suppose we're more interested in the 3 versus 4, but the 5 week weaning showed advantages as well, and it was kind of interesting. You had improved growth rates and improved feed efficiency in your pigs. But I suppose the question is, how does that affect, or how does it affect the sow? The reality is a trial would probably need to be done to show that. But evidence maybe from work with nurse sows in Denmark and other places would show that those nurse sows that are left with piglets maybe up to about 5 weeks of age, that they don't perform any worse or lose any more condition than a pig or a sow weaned at 4 weeks of age. So I wouldn't be afraid. I think, again, it's another tool in the box. If someone has a very big problem with post-weaning diarrhea or with post-weaning performance in their pigs, this is maybe something that could be looked at. But I think it'll only be for some people. I think 4 week weaning is a very good compromise. And we should stick as closely to the 26, 28 day weaning as we can.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. That's great, Peadar. Louise, thanks a million for that. Some great questions and answers there as well. So we're just going to wrap it up here now. But before I do, I'd just like to let you know that our next webinar is in a fortnight's time. It's with Jens Sørensen from Danvet in Denmark, looking at practical ways of reducing antibiotic usage and the management of pigs associated with reducing antibiotic usage. So that'll be same time, 1 p.m. Our time, on the 7th of August. Also to remind you that the webinars are all available on our website. So within a few days, today's webinar will be available. The previous two are already available on the website. You'll find them on our YouTube channel. I'm glad to report that we're getting excellent views after the webinar. So for those that can't make it here live today, we're getting over 100 views, 160 in one case. one of the webinars after the fact. So that's great to see that they've been well received. And finally, I'd just like to thank our guest speaker, Peadar Lawlor, for a brilliant presentation and Q&A session there. Thanks to Louise Clark for facilitating the questions and filtering them for Peadar. To Michelle Lavelle in the Connect Ed office for helping set up the platform and the to and fro for the panelists in advance of the webinars, and to Alison Maloney in Teagasc PR and Orla Canan in our own pig department for the promotion and PR to do with the webinars in advance of going live. So with that, I'd like to thank you finally yourselves for attending there today live. And as I say, if you have colleagues that couldn't make it today live, you can let them know that it will be available in a few days' time up on our website. So thanks for that and have a good weekend. Talk to you soon. Bye.